Hello, everybody. It's James here, WSI. We are returning finally with a big guest, a big bang. And my next guest, we said, I don't know, about 18, 19 months ago, hey, we'll do another episode in a few months because the first one went well. Well, life gets in the way. And nearly 2 years later, I'm finally happy to announce that the Bish is back. Eric Bischoff, good morning to you.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be
What,
here.
in your house?
And I'm in my house. I didn't even have to go anywhere to do this.
I was just saying before off air, just like, man, I wish I'd had a house like that. I just love the visuals of, the old age varnish wood and stuff like that. It's just like a big cabin kind of thing. 98 you built it, yeah?
Yeah, it's very homey for us. It feels very warm and very much at home. You can't see it here, but we got a big stone fireplace and buffalo head hanging over it. And the bar that you may see behind me, you get a little bit of a view of it. That bar is about 125 years old. It was in a saloon, an establishment, not too far from here, Hardin, Montana, which is very near the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn. So there's a little bit of history in here, and to know that there've been people sitting at that bar telling stories and doing all kinds of crazy shit is always a fun. It's always a conversation starter when people come into the house and see it for the first time.
Do you have a piano as well?
Piano?
Yeah, but it's piano unless you get into the Wild West, and then it's piano.
Oh no, we don't have a piano. I'm glad nobody brought that up when we were building a house. I would have had to build a bigger house to fit a piano in, and nobody plays piano in. But it would look cool. Get one of those old style pianos that they play. You can get those pianos that play themselves.
Oh,
So
I love them.
sit there and make it look like you're playing the piano. That would be great. I could do some great YouTube videos.
Oh, dude, you need to get like just an upright just somewhere in the corner if you've got the space, always. And just like a reel that plays.
I have all the native musical abilities and talent of, I don't know, a chimp, maybe.
Come on, chimps can bang a drum.
I can bang a drum. I can't keep a beat, but I can bang a drum.
The reason why I said the returning champion is back, because once again I said off air, you are by far the most popular guest I've ever had in WSI in the coming up to 4 years that I've done this, and including probably all the other podcasts. I think like the most popular clip on WSI is you talking about Hulk Hogan, and something like 700,000 plus in one clip there. So once again, I was thinking, man, I really should get Eric back sooner. And once again, just life got in the way, but I'm glad you're back now. One thing that I asked last time that I seem to remember is any stories from the UK, etc. And you always said, I think your answer was, man, I love the curry over there. But I never asked you what your favourite curry was.
I don't have. I like hot curry. I mean, I like very, very spicy curry, but I don't necessarily have a favorite. I tend to like chicken in my curry as a protein, but I'm pretty open minded. I just Indian food, obviously curry is enjoyed all over the world, but my wife and I make Indian food recipes at home because the flavor is so complex. The spices and all the ingredients that go into a good curry, or butter chicken is another one of my favorites that my wife and I both make. There's just so many spices and flavors, and they're so robust that I love learning about cooking new Indian foods. But curry, it's like a bowl of chili here in the United States. It's one of those things that just everybody loves, but on certain days when it's cold and it's rainy outside and a little overcast, man, there's nothing like a good bowl of green curry.
Oh, so you're going to Thai curries as well then?
Sure. I don't discriminate. I'll eat chili or I'll eat curry anywhere.
Have you ever ventured, because obviously the standard bearer for a hot curry is a vindaloo, have you ever ventured into foul territory? Or, almost like a curry that's more like an endurance kind of spicy?
I have, and I enjoy that to a point. Like, my test for a good curry is if I can feel, when you eat something really hot and spicy, your forehead will get a little sweaty, and that's no big deal to me. When I can feel the sweat running down the back of my head, that's the target zone. That's when it's starting to get good. But if you go too far with it, for me, if I go too far, I don't enjoy the flavor. All you're getting is the heat for the sake of the heat, and you don't get the complexity of all the other spices and ingredients. So I draw the line when the sweat starts coming down the back of my head. I know it's just right.
Where does the sweat have to go to know that he's gone too far? Dare I ask?
No, I never let it get that far.
That's the spread. My rule is I'll only have a hot curry if I'm wearing a hat, because then it'll sort of contain all the sweat, and then I can carry on with my evening. If not, I'll go for something weaker.
You've got to figure it out. I'll try that. I'll start wearing a hat.
Before we get into, because obviously I always write too many, for people at home, I always write too many questions for a guest. And before we get into that, we also have to mention a couple of other things as well. You're going to be doing a one-shot at MLW called One Shot. So how did that come about?
It's very funny. I have a YouTube show that I do usually once a week whenever I'm inspired, right? And I like to talk to people I like to interview people occasionally. You know, Conrad and I don't do guests on our podcast, 83 Weeks, but on Wise Choices over on YouTube, I like to find interesting people who are somewhat involved in the wrestling business. Perhaps they were a professional wrestler or in the wrestling business at one point, and then they've moved on to other things in their lives. And I always like to try to find out, how they, transition from this bizarre world of professional wrestling into more traditional walks of life. And there's an actor by the name of Paul Walter Hauser, who is a very, very successful actor. He's doing some things with Marvel and incredible career that this young man has had. But his passion is professional wrestling. And it's funny because we talked about it in the interview. It's like you take a look at The Rock, right? Rock comes in around 96, 77, whatever it was, becomes a huge star in the world of professional wrestling, and then transitions to feature films. Well, Paul Walter Hauser is a huge star, not Rock level yet, but he will be. He's a major star in the world of feature films in Hollywood, but he's using that success to do what he really wants to do, which is to become a professional wrestler, and a very successful one. He's very soon he's going to be training and losing a lot of weight and really getting himself in shape, because he really wants to be, he doesn't want to just do it once in a while as an attraction. He's thoroughly committed to the art of professional wrestling. So I was talking to Paul about that. I find that to be fascinating and interesting. And then in the middle of the conversation, because Paul grew up as a WCW fan. He, as a kid in the 90s, he was very familiar with all things WCW and the NWO. So we're talking about all that, reminiscing a little bit. And Paul says, you should do something again in professional wrestling. You just come back from one night and, executive produce a show. And I said, well, that'd be fun, but I don't see that ever happening. And he goes, yeah, but let me call Court Bauer. Court Bauer owns MLW. He was a former writer with the WWE. I worked with him for a minute. And Paul called Court on the phone live. My show was live. It wasn't taped. Calls Court live and says, hey, I'm talking to Eric Bischoff. I think he should come in and take over the show for one night. Just let him produce the show. I'm thinking, that's never good. I would never let somebody do that.
That's what I was just going to ask. I mean, is it just, are you just not being a figurehead? You're actually hands-on with the creative as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, he put Court on the phone live, held it up to the speaker so everybody could see, put Court on the spot, and Court said, absolutely, let's do it. So here I am. And we've kind of started the process already. Let's be real. I'm coming in for one night, so it's not like I'm going to try to, have a major impact on what they've already been doing and continue to do. But from a production point of view, you're going to see some things in that show that you perhaps haven't seen before. And some of it is going to be very subtle. It's not like going to be, whoa, did you see that? But the way I like to thread stories throughout the show, for example, the way I like to treat the very opening of the show, it's a very, very important part of the show that I think gets neglected a lot of times in television, televised wrestling. The way the interviews are conducted, I'm going to have it. It's going to be different. And again, none of these things are going to be like seismic shifts in the way people do things, They're going to be subtle, but my hope is that some of those subtle things that we do, and some of them may be more than subtle, but some of these things that we're going to do at the end of the show, I would just love people to go, okay, I see what he did there. That's pretty cool. I enjoy the show just a little bit more because of that. And if I can accomplish that, then it's a home run for me.
Have you considered for the backstage interviews doing the interview with a backdrop of some roadie package cases and have it really dimly lit and put it on TBS?
It's really funny. If you go back and watch TNA, if you can find it, towards about 2012 or 13, my partner and I, because Jason Hervey was my business partner, and we did a lot. We created a lot of reality shows and worked with a lot of big studios and networks, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot from the world of reality shows and how to integrate some of that storytelling technique into professional wrestling. And one of the things that we did that was so cool, and it had never been done before really in professional wrestling up until this point, but similar to what the scene you just described, where we would do these interviews in locations that didn't look like you would use them for an interview. Backstage, in a corner, bunch of equipment, sitting around, boxes for it, whatever. And the lighting would be good, but it wouldn't look like it was a set to be used for conducting interviews, right? And the way we call them on the fly interviews, but what you do is, like, if I was interviewing you, the camera would be framed on you and we'd probably be shooting you at a 45-degree angle or whatever, but the camera would be focused on you. I would be taking you through a series of questions, but when the interview is finally produced and edited, you never see me or you never hear my questions. All we're getting is your reaction to the questions that we're asking. Now, what makes that interesting, and it's a little difficult for people that have never done it before, is if I said, okay, what's your favorite flavor of curry? Instead of you saying, oh, I like yellow curry, or I like this kind of curry, you would answer that question by saying, I've been asked before, what's my favorite curry? I like X. So you're telling the story, but all the attention is on you. And when you're interviewing somebody that in that way, that technique, you get a much more authentic finished product because it doesn't feel stagey. You don't have somebody standing there with a microphone going, okay, Eric Bischoff, you're going to be wrestling so-and-so on Tuesday night. What are your thoughts? That we've seen so many millions of those interviews that people tend to tune them out. But if you can produce an interview that feels like it's an intimate kind of one-on-one conversation, they have so much more impact, especially when you're trying to tell a story or develop a character. So yes, to your question, the answer is yes. And it's one of the things I'm most excited about, because that is a very subtle change. That's not a dramatic overhaul of a television format, but it's a subtle change that over time has a dramatic impact because people feel they connect to the characters in a different way. They feel like they're getting to know the characters. They feel like the characters become, friends of theirs because they're being interviewed in a way that makes them feel more human, and the stories feel more organic. And when you can achieve that, shooting a professional wrestling show or producing one, it's pretty significant. Again, not something people are going to go, oh my gosh, did you see the way they did that interview? In fact, hopefully they don't notice it too much. But what they will feel is that they're more connected to either the story or the character as a result.
Now, when I said that, I think there was an interview with Renee Young on AEW, and there were two girls. I can never remember the names. I'm sorry. I'm terrible at remembering names. Two girls, and they were shaking their titties. And somehow I could still only see the packing boxes behind in the dimly lit sort of just wherever they just plonked the camera. Forget about what I was going to say. Let's talk about production of interviews, because I thought we
were going to talk about titties. Whatever.
Oh, I forgot. I'll tell you what, they got some nice ones there, let me tell you. And they barely moved, even though they were shaking them. So I can't say that they're probably real. But let's talk about the very specifically WCW. I'm going to give you a couple of different examples. One thing I really loved when Mean Gene went to WCW, and definitely further on in the Nitro days, is that there was a specific segment where Mean Gene would introduce the person he was going to interview that day. Or it would happen several times in an episode. I always loved that setup to get an interview out there, and occasionally someone would interrupt and then build the story from that interview. Another way I've really loved filming is the old WWF Superstars. They'll be standing on a blue platform, if you remember that, and then the backdrop is the fans. Makes it look big time, and then you get, instant fan reaction. And a third one, and I'm throwing a lot at you, is when there's a backstage interview but the camera is static. I don't know if this is anything you've ever thought of before, or you agree or disagree, is when the camera moves constantly from person to person or zooming in and out, that sort of distracts me a bit, and I always love the static camera because it's almost more like cinematography, a positive in that respect.
Absolutely agree with you. I think the moving camera is a technique that I don't know where it started or when it became most popular, but it was one of those things that, WWE started doing it and everybody else started doing it. And I don't know what the theory is behind it. I don't know what the theory ever was behind it as to why anybody thought that that would be a good way to get people to connect more with the talent that's being interviewed. But I hate it. It is distracting because you're not used to seeing it anywhere else. I mean, you never see anything produced in sports where the camera in an interview where the camera is constantly moving. You want to focus on the talent. You want to hear what they have to say. You want to feel like you're standing there right next to them. You don't want to get vertigo, watching an interview. So I hate that. I hate that technique. I think people are moving away from it now that WWE, there's new ownership in WWE and a lot of things have changed. Some of them subtle, some of them big. But I think that technique is starting to kind of fade away from the business.
As far as old production goes, let's talk about production of even territories or, AWA 80s, 90s, or even into the somewhere around that era that you grew up with that they just don't do anymore that you would like to see come back. I mean, we can be talking about cameras, lighting, angles, anything like that.
I mean, there's really not much, to be honest. In fact, a good friend of mine sent me a video this morning from back in the 1960s in Chicago, a professional wrestling event. And look, they were very, very basic. I mean, 3 camera shoots, maybe. Audio was what the audio was back in the day because of technology. None of that, I don't think any of that really has a place today. I think people have gotten so accustomed to higher production values that to try to integrate any of the early days of professional wrestling and television, to try to introduce any of that technique would be awkward, for an entire show. Yeah, I mean, I think you could do things, for a segment. If it's a flashback segment, even though it may be current action, and I'm really just thinking off the top of my head here, I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but one of the things that I might explore at some point in time is if we're producing a segment that has a connection to the past, if it's a nostalgia themed segment, even if the talent is current talent, shooting that in a kind of grainy black and white type footage would be interesting, and affecting the audio so it feels a little bit more like the audio from back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, that's fun, and it draws attention to you because it's different than what you used to see. And I think something like that could be fun. But beyond that, there's not really, I think, anything that we could reintroduce in today's audience.
I was going to suggest one thing is less cuts. Now, I know that since Kevin Dunn has gone, they've really reduced the amount of cuts in WWE, but some of the old school professional wrestling where it's one camera, the hard camera, and it's just there. That's it. No zooming in, no zooming out. Occasionally just following the action, and that's about it for minutes on end. And for some, because I guess I would fall under millennial, because I'm not too far off 40, I guess, then I would still be treated by, I imagine, TV production people as a complete idiot who needs to have 14 cuts every second to keep my attention. But I don't know if it's just an age thing or whatever, but I never enjoyed the cuts, and I've always found like World of Sport or some of the older territories really charming for the just lack of camera cuts. You just focus on the action. Could you even get away with that these days?
I don't think so. I think people have become so accustomed to the fast-paced presentation of everything. Everything, but I hear people talking, I'm not really in the business anymore, so it's not like I have my finger on the pulse, but so often I hear people talking about the attention span of television viewers, and it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And I think part of that is because of social media. There's so much content, and people get so much content on social media, and it's all very short form type of stories and presentations. People are just getting conditioned to get all of their dopamine, whatever kind of a rush they get from watching whatever they're watching, but they want to get it quick and then move on. And we've all kind of accommodated that as producers. We're producing now for the short attention span of the audience because, in my opinion, the audience is kind of getting dumber and dumber and dumber. Not the wrestling audience necessarily, but I mean anybody that consumes media today just wants to get in and get out. They don't want to think about it too much. They don't want information that's presented to them that encourages them to think. When people watch television and more social media, they just want to feel. They want that instant dopamine rush. Make me feel angry. Make me feel happy. Make me feel sad. Make me feel fear, which is primarily what you get in social media. Is somehow find a way to make me fearful so that I have to come back and get more information so I can become more fearful. That's how you capture people. And I'm with you. I don't appreciate that. And I think what ends up the casualty in that process is the connection to the subject, no matter what it is. If it's politics, you become a casualty because you're not digging deep enough to fully understand both sides of an issue, or all three sides of an issue in some cases, because the information you're seeing is just designed to make you feel something, not think about something.
I didn't ask this you before. I apologise. MLW One Shot. One, what date is it? And two, you are kindly giving your wages, your fee for that day to charity as well.
Yes, it's December 5th in New York. I don't have the information here, but go to the MLW website and we'll find it for you, or you'll find it for yourself. But yeah, it's December 5th in New York City, and I think it's in Queens, New York. So I'm looking forward to that. It's always fun to get back to New York. There's a lot of great restaurants, a lot of things to check out. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, you're right indeed. Melrose Ballroom, Queens, New York, December 5th. There you go.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you.
And you are, do you want to mention the charity as well?
Tunnel to Towers. Tunnel to Towers is a charity here in the United States that provides financial assistance, essentially pays off the existing mortgages on homes where if a wife loses her husband and she's got, they have kids and family and obligations, if whether it's a police officer, fireman, somebody in the military service, if they lose their lives serving their country or their community, Tunnel to Towers comes in to provide financial assistance and pay off, in many cases, pay off the existing mortgages for the survivors of that type of thing. So it's a very, very popular charity here in the United States. My wife and I donate monthly anyway, but this was a way to maybe just bring a little more attention to it and a little more money than we typically donate every month.
And fine charity is, and good for you for doing that as well. Let's get to the interview proper, I guess. And I've already teed you up for what this is going to be. It's going to be the first question proper I was going to ask you. A few days ago, last Friday, I believe, Dave Meltzer had roted in his little newsletter something about Dutch Mantel. Now, I don't need to go through it all, and I promise you, everybody, this is going to be really the last time I mention it, because I did a video on my own. I did a video with Dutch about the situation, but I'll clue people in sort of the abridged version. Dutch was very, very sick. He still is sick. His wife is sick. His daughter released a GoFundMe. It did so much better than anyone had even a right to think it would do. They were hoping for, ultimately, they were thinking $5,000, $10,000, and they'd be more than grateful. It ended up going to, just last check, just shy of 105,000.
Oh, that is so wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah, tell me about it as well. I'm so happy. And I spoke to his daughter, Amanda, and, she's over the moon. She's like, done a big list of everything that they're going to do to sort of make their lives better, because it's a daily struggle for them both at the same time. That being said, Dave Meltzer then decided that this sort of act of charity, this milk of human kindness, then really had to be some sort of crusade of his own to belittle Dutch in some way with his ramblings and talking about, well, Dutch has been horrible about AEW. It's like, no, we've been critical. Not horrible. Never been horrible to Tony Khan the Man. And Tony Khan the Man, who, from all intents and purposes, is a lovely, lovely guy, donated $5,000 to the GoFundMe. We've never criticised the man. We've only criticised the AEW booking, as I'm sure it's the same with you. I'm sure it's the same with other podcasters as well. Now, you read it. What do you think of it all?
Unfortunately, I wasn't surprised. It's just another example of how disconnected Dave Meltzer is from anything outside of his own bizarre little bubble. And Dave, I don't know what it is about Dave. Well, I take that back. I think I do, to a degree. Tony Khan and Dave Meltzer talk all the time. Now, I'm not in the room when they talk, so I'm I guess spreading a rumor, but I've heard from so many people that are close to Tony and Dave that have all said the same thing. Tony relies on Dave Meltzer's input way too much. Dave Meltzer has way too much influence over Tony Khan and the end product. Now, Dave isn't there producing the show or writing the show that I know of, but definitely has a lot of influence. And for Dave Meltzer, that's like, finally, after all these years of trying to convince everybody that I'm a wrestling expert and I know how to produce a wrestling show and I know more about the wrestling business than anybody else because I study it. You hear him talking about how he studies the business. He's just a fan like everybody else. He's an obsessive compulsive fan, unlike most people, but there are a lot of them. There are a lot of obsessive compulsive Dave Meltzer type fans out there. And that's where Dave's comfort zone is. But because Dave now has direct connection to Tony Khan, and Tony Khan has a nationally televised, professional wrestling show, Dave feels validated. For the first time in his miserable fucking life, he feels validation. So that when Dutch or me or Jim Cornette or Bruce Pritchard or anybody else criticizes the product, Dave takes that way personally, because now we're criticizing something that he has influence in or over. And it's the first time in Dave's miserable life that he's ever had any form of validation other than, the group of little weirdos that follow him and believe everything he says. So I think that's why he reacts the way he does and says some of the stupidest things that I've ever heard anybody say, talking about the television industry and his view of the wrestling world and what works and what doesn't work. And look, a lot of us have that. I'll do the same thing with, American football. I have strong opinions about it because I like watching it, but I don't know how to play the game. I've never touched a football in a competitive environment. I've never produced a football game. I've never worked in the NFL, but I've got some opinions I like to spout off every once in a while if there's somebody dumb enough to take my word for some of the stuff I say. And that's Dave Meltzer. Somehow he's convinced himself that he's an expert of the business. Tony Khan thinks he's an expert and takes his direction, I guess, in a lot of ways, but it's failing so miserably. You obviously saw last week's show because you talked about the girl shaking her tits. That was maybe the worst professional wrestling episode I have ever seen on a major television platform. That show was so horrible from the very beginning until the very end that I couldn't believe what I was watching. Like, how does anybody let this happen in prime time on a major cable outlet? It really was like a bunch of 10-year-old kids got together and produced a wrestling show for a high school project. That's what it looked like to me and felt like. It was just embarrassingly bad.
It's funny, I just listened to Meltzer's review of that show. He said it was pretty good. Wouldn't you believe?
Kidding.
Oh, no, it wasn't the show's fault. It was the fans' fault for being quiet.
I mean, what a distorted up. I mean, it's a completely inverted reality. And this is the guy who studies the business, professes to know what works in wrestling and what doesn't work, that can't connect the obvious dots between a performer and the audience. It's not the audience's fault if the performer or the storylines are just not interesting. They're not going to react because you want them to. People are going to react because you've created a story and characters and moments that's playing out in front of them that evokes, it creates emotion. If the talent or the stories don't create the emotion, what are people supposed to react to? I don't know. It's just another example of just how inverted Dave's world really is.
You used to talk to him though, didn't you? I don't know if you ever liked the guy or were friends with him, but I believe you used to talk to him in the WCW days. Has he changed over the years as far as you're concerned?
No, he's exactly the same. Let me tell you a little story about that. There was a guy by the name of Zane Breslov,
Mm-hmm.
worked for WCW. Zane had previously worked, he was a promoter, he was an independent promoter, but WWE would use him if they were going to different markets where Zane was very, because Zane also produced rock and roll. If the Stones were coming to town, Zane and his company, along with perhaps another company, would handle the promotion in that local market. So Zane had very deep relationships with local media and potential advertisers and sponsors. That's what Zane did. Zane left WWE, came to work for WCW, and Zane and I became pretty good friends. Very different people, obviously, but there was a lot of things I really enjoyed about Zane. And Zane was friends with Dave Meltzer. So after a while, Zane was kind of chipping away because he knew how I felt about Dave Meltzer. I felt the same way then as I do today. And Zane said, man, you just got to give him a chance. Just, I know he says some stupid shit and I know he's wrong about a lot of stuff, but he's really a good guy. You should really get to know him. So I thought, all right, I don't want to be so close-minded that I refuse to talk to anybody. Just because I don't like them doesn't mean that they don't have some value. So I thought, all right, I'll give it a shot. And I started having somewhat regular conversations, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks for 15 minutes, right? And my hope, my intention was that if I gave Dave Meltzer access to me, then perhaps rather than just writing stupid shit that he heard through the grapevine, so to speak, that he would feel like he had access. He could call me directly and ask whatever questions he wanted to ask or get whatever information that he felt that he wanted to write about, at least get an opinion from someone other than whoever his sources were. Didn't work. He had access to me. He could have asked questions. He could have confirmed stories. He could have confirmed rumors. He could have at least tried because other people like Mike Johnson from the PW Insider, Dave Shear, PW Insider, Wade Keller, and there's been others that write about wrestling that even back then would say, hey, I'm writing a story. We heard this is going on. Don't know for sure or not. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Or do you want to deny it? They would at least make an attempt. And Dave would never do that. Dave didn't want confirmation. He didn't want to double source a story. He just wanted to write his stupid shit as long as it fell into his narrative. Dave has a very, he hates WWE no matter what he says because they won't give him the time of day, despite the fact that he tries to convince people he's got access. He doesn't. And when he does make a connection inside of WWE, I know this for a fact, they feed him some of the dumbest shit and he runs with it. And they do it because every time they feed him stupid shit, he runs with it. Within a matter of days, it makes Dave look like a complete idiot. He sets himself up because he doesn't double check stories. He just goes with one source.
The Backlash is going to be at the Tokyo Dome next year.
I read that. What a dumb shit. Yeah, so for a guy that's got access to WWE, he runs with a stupid rumor that obviously was false. But WWE does that, and they do it to entertain themselves. I used to do it. Now, I wouldn't feed Dave information, but I would have other people feed Dave information that I knew he would run with because it would make him look dumber than he already did. And he's still doing it to this day.
Oh, dearie me. I actually written here. Do you think Meltzer takes every AEW criticism as a personal attack? I think for the most part, people would agree with that. Do you think he? Do you think his blind approach to being positive to whatever AEW does, or adding superlatives? Oh, it was a good match in AEW. Oh, it was a great match. Always sort of bumping it up a couple of stars. In his own parlance. Does that hurt AEW ultimately?
That's a really good question, brother. And I pointed this out a couple of weeks ago. What Tony Khan doesn't know, because Tony lives in his own world. He lives in a bubble that is different than everybody else's. Let's put it that way. He's disconnected from the vast majority of the wrestling audience, but he doesn't care. He doesn't recognize it. And Dave Meltzer's much the same way. But here's what happens. The more Dave Meltzer tries to defend, to spin, to add superlatives, as you say, to some of the things that are going on, to try to give people the impression that the product is actually better than it is, the harder Dave tries to defend AEW, the more your average person is looking at AEW and they're listening to Meltzer's shit. It's like, dude, you're flat out wrong. This shit sucks. I don't care what you say. It sucks. And Meltzer is so active in promoting AEW that he's actually hurting the product. People's visceral reaction to some of the stupid shit that Dave says and does is actually becoming a reflection of AEW because he's so connected to that brand. If I was Tony Khan and I was friends with Dave, I would say, Dave, please just shut the fuck up. Don't write about me. Don't talk about me. Just talk about everything else, but leave me out of your shit because you're actually hurting my brand. He is a de facto surrogate or representative of AEW, and he does such a horrible job at it that he's actually inflicting damage on the brand itself and the product.
Let's leave Meltzer there. I mean, I'm sure we could do a weekly 2-hour.
My blood pressure's going up and shit like that.
Well, almost like you're having a medium hot curry. You feel the sweat coming from
running down the back of my head.
Yeah. Well, we'll do something else. And I figured this is something you've been asked before, but I never got to ask you this. And the reason I'm asking is because there is a Ted Turner documentary coming out, I believe, on Max, 6-part series on the life of Ted Turner. Now, back in the Monday Night Wars, of course, or whatever else WWE has produced, it's all WWE stuff framing it this way, of course. The battle is Vince McMahon versus Ted Turner. Now, why do you believe that the narrative WWE has always put out there has always been Vince McMahon versus Ted Turner and never Vince McMahon versus Eric Bischoff or Vince McMahon versus Kip Fry, for God's sake? I mean, whoever else, who was the actual head of WCW at the time. Why is he always putting it on to Ted Turner? Because my opinion is Vince McMahon's name might not even come up in this 6-part Ted Turner documentary, whereas if it was the other way around, Ted Turner would be mentioned several times.
Yeah, well, look, if you go back to the mid to late 90s, particularly 95, when Nitro started, 96, 97, 98, during that period of time, WCW was dominating WWE. 95 when Nitro first started, we were kind of even. There was parity there. One week we'd win, the next week he'd win. They might get 2 weeks in a row, and then we'd get 2 weeks in a row. So there was parity there, I think, in our performance. But of course, once the NWO hit 1996, it wasn't that way anymore. We were dominating WWE, and that's when Vince started the Ted Turner campaign, meaning big, bad billionaire Ted is trying to put poor little WWE, this family-owned business. It's just my wife and I and my kids, and this corporate monster is trying to put us out of business. Vince wanted to frame himself as the underdog. And I get that. I understand that. For Vince McMahon to say, well, in this Eric Bischoff character, who's really only been in a business for 20 minutes, I never even heard of him before, really, and now he's kicking my ass every week. That would tell the story that Vince wanted to tell. Vince wanted to convince the world, create the narrative that the real battle was between Vince McMahon and Ted Turner, when in reality, Ted Turner had nothing to do with our show. I never had a meeting. I had one meeting with Ted about wrestling, and it was about international distribution. It had nothing to do about characters. It had nothing to do with storylines. Ted would call me like Tuesday afternoons when the ratings came out for Monday night. Ted would call my office typically, especially in the very beginning. If the ratings came out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone would ring at 4:10, and it was Ted Turner on the other end. And he was happy as hell. He was giddy because WCW was finally living up to the vision that Ted had for it. Ted really believed that professional wrestling is a great property. It's an important thing for a network to have because it draws so many people into it that are middle class. This is not highbrow entertainment. This is just your average, working person, whether it's in the UK or here in the States. It's, now you do get some other demos in wrestling, but Ted really believed in the product. So once WCW started being successful and outperformed WWE, Ted was very excited about that. But other than those phone calls, Ted never had anything to do with the business. But Vince wanted to make it look like Ted Turner was just trying to grind him into oblivion. Nothing is further from the truth.
Did you ever, I don't know if you ever sought it or wanted it, but did you ever get validation from Vince McMahon, for you personally, for what you achieved?
No, no, not really. It's funny, I worked for Vince. So I was there for 3-4 years and worked, creatively. When I say creatively, I mean as a performer. So from 2002 to 2006, I was there as a talent. And obviously as a talent, there were some times when I wrestled Vince McMahon or something that looked like a wrestling match. There were a lot of things that I did with Vince as a performer, but I never really had any kind of a serious conversation with him. We never said, hey, by the way, back in 96, what were you thinking? Or, I always wanted to ask him, why the hell didn't you show up when I challenged you to fight? You should have done that. But we never had those types of conversations. And when I was there for a couple months as an executive, same thing. We just never touched on that. The closest I think I ever got to any kind of validation was at the Hall of Fame ceremony. Right before I went out, Vince pulled me aside and, shook my hand and he said something to the effect of, man, you really turned the world upside down, didn't you? I just nodded my head and that was it. That's probably the closest that we came.
Is it anything you ever wanted, essentially? Or is it, were you happy with that comment that Vince made at the Hall of Fame?
Of course. I mean, for Vince, you got to at least have a little bit of an insight into Vince McMahon. For him, that probably took a lot. It was probably so. I didn't really care one way or the other. I never sought out Vince McMahon's validation. I'm quite comfortable with what I did and how I did it, and where I stand in the world of professional wrestling as a result. So I've never really needed a lot of validation from anybody. But it was a nice little thing for Vince to say because I know him well enough to know how hard that probably was for him.
Speaking of Vince McMahon, so a video did for your podcast, 83 Weeks, a couple of weeks ago, got some traction. Was you saying that you think that Vince McMahon, or you knew, or you had a feeling that Vince McMahon would be sticking his head above the parapet sort of sooner rather than later with some sort of new venture? He can't help himself. He can't just retire on his boat, the sexy bitch, and sail off into the sunset, which is his boat's name, by the way. That being said, TKO's COO Mark Shapiro revealed recently he had breakfast with Vince McMahon. He said it was very, very more than cordial, very friendly. Vince is very pleased with WWE, how it's going. Mark said he's got some litigation he's working through, obviously. And frankly, he wants his privacy, etc. But, he's coming out with what Mike Johnson called an entertainment hub company. That being said, Mark Shapiro is still in contact with Vince McMahon. Donald Trump is now president-elect and is also good friends with Vince McMahon. Can you foresee any future where he's at least criminally pardoned, he sorts out civil litigation, and he returns to WWE?
No, absolutely not. That'll never happen. I've got a little bit of inside information that I believe to be credible. Vince has purchased, according to this source, And the source is a public figure. He's in the entertainment business as an agent, so that's why I have to protect his name. But according to this individual, Vince has recently purchased property in Santa Monica. Santa Monica, California is one of the more expensive commercial areas in California. But he's purchased some production facilities in Santa Monica, has hired a couple people. One of them, Kristen Prouty, who was formerly associated with WWE. She was based in Los Angeles, did a lot of PR stuff, was able to access celebrities. And anytime we wanted to use somebody in a WWE program that we didn't have a direct relationship from the world of Hollywood, Kristen would be the one that would find a way to make a connection and hopefully negotiate a deal. So she had been there for quite a while. At least she was there in 2019 when I was there, and she had been there quite a while before that. So she could get about 10 years, I guess, working for Vince indirectly. She didn't report to Vince, but she worked with him. He hired her, and he hired another woman, and I can't remember her name, but she also worked in the public relations department of WWE. She was pregnant. Her and her husband were expecting, I think, their first child, and she got let go. Once TKO and WWE merged, there was some duplication there, right? It always happens. If WWE had 10 PR people and TKO had 10 PR people, well, we don't need 20. Let's merge them together, and maybe we only need 6 or 8, right? So this other woman, who's now working for Vince McMahon, along with Kristen Prouty, she's working there as well. One of Vince's projects, evidently, is his perspective on the Monday Night Wars. And according to what I've heard, he's got a version that nobody else has ever heard before, which I find that to be fascinating. Now, and maybe from Vince's perspective, there were things about that Monday Night War that haven't been discussed. So I don't want to just shit on it. But man, you talk about a subject that's been done to death. Man, wow. But that's one thing. I don't know much about their business plan. I don't think anybody does at this point. I think, based on what I'm hearing, Vince is waiting for the civil suit. Well, probably both of them, the civil and the legal situation. He's being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. He's waiting really for those things to be resolved before he comes out and publicly starts talking about what he's doing.
Do you think with Trump in power again, do you think all of that might disappear sooner rather than later? Or is that me being overly conspiratorial?
It's not going to have any effect on the civil suit.
No.
That's going to be what it's going to be. I think in terms of the SEC investigation, that's the Department of Justice, which, part of the executive branch. So could it? Sure, it could. Will it? I don't know. I don't even want to guess. Politics is so weird. I don't even want to try to guess.
Okay, then. So quite a few of my questions from now are going to be a bit more scattershot because, as I say, some questions I wrote this morning, some questions I wrote 18 months or so ago when I first interviewed you, because I had just read Nitro, Guy Evans' book on WCW, easily the best coverage of WCW in book form, and I think there's an extended version as well, so free plug, Guy, for you there. That being said, there's a couple of things that I really, really want to know, a couple of things revolving around Hulk Hogan. One of them was when I interviewed Kevin Sullivan, sadly the late Kevin Sullivan, who I talked to quite a few times. He always said that Hulk Hogan's contracts with WCW wasn't with WCW, it was with Turner, but he had a special contract called a personal services contract. What does that entail, and why is it different to other contracts?
I don't know how accurate that is. It may be accurate. To be very honest with you, I don't recall that Hogan's contract, in terms of the way it was structured between performing services as a talent and personal services, that does not sound familiar to me. And again, I want to be respectful of Kevin because he was a good friend and a good man, and he never would intentionally, deceive anybody when it comes to things like this. He was a professional wrestler, so he got paid to deceive. But when it comes to this type of thing, Kevin had a lot of integrity. I don't really know if that's true or not. Or it could be Kevin's interpretation of something that he heard about Hulk Hogan's contract, because Kevin wasn't involved in that process. And Hulk wasn't very forthcoming when it came to details of his contract. He kept things professional and private. So I don't know how accurate that is. That's the best way I can respond to it.
How integral were you to actually structuring his original contract with WCW and then like the 1998 revised version of the contract where I think he ended up making, what, nearly $7 million a year? And that's in 98 money as well.
I was involved a lot in the very beginning. And once we arrived at, 1994, Hulk Hogan's first contract, the renewals were really minor adjustments. Now, sometimes those minor adjustments, ended up with Hulk Hogan making a lot more money, but the basic elements of the contract remain the same. Sometimes the percentages of revenue that he would share in, those may have changed during the renewal process, but the basic outline of the agreement was essentially the same as the one he had in 1994.
I always love his. I'll move on in a second, but I always love his contract, where it's $20,000 a month to wear the NWO shirt, and then 20% of the gate, or what, a certain percentage of the gate or the pay-per-view revenue over a certain threshold or whatever. Then at the bottom, it's $175 per diem for sandwiches or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Hulk really got paid. He got paid essentially a flat fee. Like his first contract, he committed to 4 pay-per-views a year. And each pay-per-view, he would also do, I think it was 4 television appearances leading up to because you got to tell the story on television. You got to spend a month promoting it, right? So each one of those pay-per-views, 4 of them a year, also included, I think it was 4 TV dates to promote it. And he was paid $500,000 per pay-per-view. Now, one of the other incentives that we built into the contract was we took the average of WCW pay-per-views over the course of 2 years, right? So let's say over the course of 2 years, each WCW pay-per-view generated, just for round numbers, $1 million in revenue. Hulk Hogan got paid $500,000. And if the pay-per-view did more than $2 million, in other words, there's a massive increase because of his participation, he also received an additional bonus. It was an incentive program. And what's interesting is everybody likes to talk about how much money I paid Hulk Hogan, and he got $7 or $8 million for doing this or doing that. What people don't realize is WCW's revenues escalated dramatically because of Hulk Hogan.
He was underpaid at one point.
Huh?
He was underpaid at one point in 97, 98. Yeah.
You could argue that. Because of Hulk's influence and the positive contributions he made as a character, part of the NWO story, obviously, the fact that we paid him according to our success and bonused him according to his success shouldn't be that bizarre or that complicated of a formula for people to understand. But people just want to focus on the money. Oh, Hulk Hogan wasn't worth it. He didn't really, they should have paid Sting more money, whatever. It's silly, uneducated horse shit, but it's out there. Thanks to guys like Dave Meltzer.
He was worth every single penny. When Nitro came out, he was wrestling every single week as well. And
because by that time he started enjoying it.
Yeah,
right. He didn't care about the dates in his contract. He never even. I don't think he even paid attention to it, to be honest, because Nitro he was having so much fun with the NWO story and the reaction that he was getting from the crowd. If you go back and watch WCW prior to the NWO and Hulk Hogan's turn, go back and watch Hulk Hogan, say late 1994, early 1995, and don't pay attention to anything at all that you see other than the crowd reaction. He was losing it. He was losing the audience. He wasn't, not that he still had the audience behind him, but not to the same intense degree, right? And Hulk started feeling that. He was very much aware of it. And I think he was feeling a little bad about it, which is why when the NWO opportunity came along and he saw, man, if I turn heel, this is a great story. Kevin Nash, Scott Hall. If I'm the third guy, I might be able to get that crowd back. And that's exactly what happened. If you compare the reaction to Hulk Hogan late 94, early 1995 to the reaction to Hulk Hogan in 96, 97, 98, it's a completely different story. And it was a good move for him, and it was obviously a good move for WCW.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if this is something that Bruce Pritchard made up once for a shoot interview DVD, but you'll know better than anybody. Bruce Pritchard once claimed that in late 97, early 98, Hulk Hogan was all locked and loaded, ready to go back to the WWF. And Bruce claimed that the creative in place was that Hulk Hogan was going to then be the leader of D-Generation X. Is that something that is complete revisionist history, or if you cast your mind back, was any validity to that at the time?
I certainly have no insight as to what the creative plans may have been for a Hulk Hogan return. Here's what I do know, though, because I was there, sort of. Nitro was taking place in Denver, I believe. And Hulk came to me earlier in the day, and he said, "Hey, Eric, I just want to let you know I'm going to be meeting with Vince McMahon after the show tonight. Because I don't want you to hear about it from somebody else. I don't want you to think there's anything going on." He said, "Vince called me. He's going to be in town anyway. He wanted to get together. I'm sure he wants me to come back." But he said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to take the meeting, but I want you to know, in case you hear it, I'm not going anywhere. But I am going to take the meeting." I said, "Cool. I would if I were you. Why not? Go grab a free steak and a beer, whatever." And the next morning, I got a call from Hulk, and he downloaded me. He downloaded the conversation that he had with Vince. It was very superficial. There was no discussion of him coming back as the leader of it. Now, maybe Bruce is right. Maybe the writing team and Vince got together and said, "Man, I'm going to get together with Hulk, and if we can get him back, he could be this, whatever." I'm not saying that didn't happen, but Hulk's interest in going back to the WWE during that period of time, he didn't even use it as a negotiation. He wasn't even using that meeting as leverage. He didn't want me to find out from a Dave Meltzer type that there was something going on behind my back. He was very, very straightforward about that, and equally straightforward about the results of the meeting, which is hey, it was great to see Vince, but I'm not going anywhere.
Did he ever discuss terms, or did Vince not even offer
I don't think
a number?
It never got that. It never got that far.
The way Bruce said it, it was down to the wire. It could have happened, but maybe that might just be Bruce's version.
Look, Bruce is one of my dearest friends. I love Bruce Pritchard. He's a good person. But like a lot of us in the wrestling business, you start telling stories over and over and over again. Part of what we're good at is making something that isn't really that interesting feel like it really is. And I've done it. I catch myself. I'm trying to be aware of it. But it's like when people ask me the same questions over and over again, part of the way that I'm able to answer them in a genuine way is by making them feel a little bigger than they really were. It's not lying, it's not being deceitful, but it's just adding a little more drama than perhaps really existed. And I think that's probably if Bruce is guilty of anything, it might be that.
One more thing about Hogan. Obviously, he has a reputation as somebody who may not have always been the easiest to do business with. There's the story that Undertaker came out with some months ago. He dropped Hulk Hogan with the tombstone, and there's about 3 feet gap between the canvas and his head, and then he goes, "Oh, you got me, brother," and other things where he doesn't particularly like putting people over at certain times, to use the wrestling parlance. Was there anybody that you knew that Hulk Hogan felt really could be his successor? Because, the old story, the Ultimate Warrior was going to be his successor and Hulk Hogan wasn't happy about it. But later on in WCW, WWE, or even TNA, who did he look at as the guy who he would really love to pass the torch to?
I'm uncomfortable speaking for Hulk on this because it's so easy to be wrong. But I think if I look back when Paul White came to WCW, the Giant, because Hulk Hogan had so much respect, love for Andre the Giant, Hulk knew that Andre was really the one that was in large part responsible for Hulk Hogan becoming Hulk Hogan to the level that he was. He was already a big star. He was already a star. But once WrestleMania, I think it was WrestleMania, wherever it was, 3, can't remember. don't keep track of the shit. But wherever it was when Hulk beat Andre the Giant, that was when Hulk's life turned around as a character. So when Paul White came in, I think Hulk looked at Paul as the next Andre the Giant. And I think Hulk's, I don't know what his motivations truly were deep down inside, because you got to remember, Hulk never thought of himself as, I'm going to retire from this business. My days are numbered. It's time to leave. No athlete, no performer, no musician. Fuck, ask Mick Jagger. He's still out there touring. He doesn't need the money, but he needs the connection to the crowd. That connection to the crowd is as real and tangible for a performer as that microphone in front of your face is to you, right? And I don't think Hulk was ever in a frame of mind where he's saying, in another 2 years, I'm going to walk away and this is going to be the guy. But he looked at Paul White as someone who could be the next Andre the Giant and eventually probably be the guy to put out Hulk Hogan at the end. Other than that, I don't think I never saw him get really super excited about any other character. He appreciated them and respected them and loved working with them. He loved working with Sting. He really respected Sting a lot. Lex Luger, he did the job, so to speak, for Lex Luger. He had respect for Lex towards the end there. So there were people that he always respected and liked to work with, but I think Paul White was the only one that he could see to be the next version of a Hulk Hogan type character.
So we're finally going to get to the game that I wrote 2 years ago. We're finally going to get to it. So it's the firing line. I'm going to give you some names, essentially. It's as easy as it gets. You can just give them one word or move on, or you can throw in a good story for them. There are names from every era of your career and every single promotion, hopefully, that I've included as well. So some of these names might be random, and I nearly gave away the first one there, and it's Rick Rude.
Wow. Intense, loyal, intense and loyal, and a great performer.
Doug Summers and Playboy Buddy Rose.
Barely remember them.
You kidding?
I mean, obviously I remember them in AWA, but as a fan, I never got close to him as a fan. I certainly didn't work with him, so don't really have much of an impression of either one of them.
Fair enough then. I should have said Colonel De Beers or someone maybe.
Colonel De Beers was a little different cat. Colonel De Beers, he didn't like me at all. He looked at me, because when I started with Vern, I didn't come from I worked for a food processor. I was a salesman. And all of a sudden, I walk into the wrestling business and now I'm holding the microphone. I'm interviewing guys like Colonel De Beers, and I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I was horrible at it. I just looked like a weatherman. I looked like the guy that you see on television news, but I didn't have any skills, didn't have any talent. So when Colonel De Beers had to work with me, it was kind of like, ugh, that piece of shit. I got to work with him. He didn't have any respect for me at all, but I understood it. It didn't hurt my feelings. It made sense.
When you were with the AWA, did you get close to any of the wrestlers?
No, I got close to Vern and Greg Gagne. Did things with them outside of the office. We would go pheasant hunting together and duck hunting together, and I really enjoyed their company. But that was it. As far as wrestlers, there were some like Brad Ringens. Brad I knew from high school. Brad Ringens was the guy who was training for Vern, out at the farm, they called it. But I knew, Brad happened to be there, but I knew Brad from high school. So there were a couple people like that, but for the most part, no.
I know we were talking about TV production before, but please, whatever you do, when you go to MLW, don't have the late AWA production where they green screened fans in a tunnel. Did you ever see that video?
Oh yeah, I was part of that.
No,
the team challenge series is what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, there's one with the big pink room, but then there's also a green screen where I saw Sergeant Slaughter saluting nobody and like doing an entrance ramp. It's the sorriest state of affairs.
Yeah, Vern was really in bad shape financially by that point in time. he had been funding AWA out of his own financial reserves for a long time. And Vern had a beautiful piece of property in an area outside of Minneapolis. It's called Lake Minnetonka. Very, very exclusive area, beautiful lake, beautiful countryside. And Vern long ago had bought a beautiful piece of property right on that lake. And I don't know how big it was. It might have been 30 or 40 acres. It was substantial. And Vern built a beautiful home on it. He built a beautiful horse barn because his daughter Donna Gagne was very much into horses. And the state of Minnesota, here in the United States, they've got a law called the law of eminent domain, which basically says if the government wants your shit, they're just going to take it. You don't have any vote. You don't get to argue about it. They're going to give you a check, whatever they think your property is worth. They're going to give you the check, and you either take the check or they're going to evict you from the property and take it anyway. It's really ridiculous. And the state of Minnesota wanted that piece of property. Now, that piece of property was paid for. I don't know how much it was worth. Today, it would be worth probably 80 to 100, $120 million because of its location and the prime property that it was. But Vern owned it outright, and he was able to borrow money against it in order to keep AWA going. So he would take out a second mortgage, and he'd take out a third mortgage, and he'd take out a fourth mortgage. And that's how AWA continued to exist from about 1988 to the time that it finally closed, because by the time it finally closed, Vern couldn't leverage that property anymore. He had leveraged it as much as he could. The banks wouldn't give him any more money. The courts were working really hard to take it from him anyway. And that's what ultimately led to the demise. So the scenes you're talking about, or that period of time that you're referencing, was probably right before, within a year or two of when he had to shut the doors. He just didn't really have the finances to really produce the type of show that he wanted to produce.
How bad did the ticket sales get towards the last weeks and months of AWA's existence?
They're probably a lot like AEW's are now.
Okay, so the next name on our list, William Regal.
Incredibly knowledgeable and a class act and a good man.
Alex Wright.
Completely underrated, wrong place, wrong time. Could have been a major star.
I'm glad you said that, because I really liked the Berlin character, and the thing that as soon as Russo got in, it just got cut off.
Alex could have been a major player in this industry. He had all of the tools. He's a very bright, very creative, easy to work with, incredible athlete, amazing look, and understood the business. You know, he grew up in it. His father was in the industry, so he understood what really worked in professional wrestling and why.
His father was English as well. Wilder sports star wrestler who went over to Germany. Wahoo McDaniel.
Gave my son Garrett his first bump.
Well, I've got to know the story here.
Garrett's first bump was from Wahoo McDaniel. I worked in AWA, and Garrett might have been 4 years old at the time, and it was a Friday evening. You know, we pretty much started shutting the office down around 4:30, 5 o'clock. It was early on a Friday, and there was always a refrigerator on Friday nights. It was filled with beer, because Wahoo McDaniel and Ray Stevens were the two bookers, right, that worked for Vern. And at the end of the day, they liked to crack a beer on Friday. So it was a big office, you know, we had, and we would all sit around in the lobby of that office and have a couple beers. And, you know, I'd sit there and listen to wrestling stories from Vern and Greg and Wahoo and Ray Stevens. And occasionally some of the other former wrestlers like Nick Bockwinkel would come by on a Friday afternoon and have a beer with us or whatever. And my son Garrett, who was, like I said, 3 or 4 years old at the time, he's running around just being a kid. And Wahoo picks him up with one hand and holds him up, like, you know, just making him laugh and giggle. And then somehow Garrett was squirming around, and Wahoo lost him. And he dropped him right on his head on the floor. And of course, Garrett got up. He was laughing. He thought it was funny. Didn't get hurt. But yeah, My son Garrett took his first bump in the wrestling business from Wahoo McDaniels when he was 4.
You know, when you said that, I thought, did he chop your son?
No, he felt horrible. He's scared to death. But my son got up and started, laughing and giggling and running around being a kid. So it was all good.
Now, Generation Me, which is the Young Bucks.
It, I don't really have much of an opinion about them, good or bad. They seem like nice kids when I worked with them in TNA. Um, I never really got to know them. As performers, I think they're highly overrated. I think they're very athletic and they can do some really cool things visually, but I don't think they have even the vaguest notion of what makes wrestling work, other than their extremely impressive athletic ability. But that's not enough. And they haven't connected those dots yet. They're horrible characters. They haven't found a character yet that works for either one of them.
Dear, were you not a fan of the EVP thing then?
No, it was horrible. It was stupid. It was just not believable. There was nothing about that story or those two that would make you believe it. I mean, I hate to say it this way, but it does sometimes come down to just human nature and basic fundamentals of psychology. It's really, wrestling especially, is not really any more complex than that. It's good guys versus bad guys. It's believability and credibility. It's larger than life characters. The Young Bucks, Generation Me, whatever they're called, don't check any of those boxes. From just a reality point of view, neither one of them could fight their way out of a wet paper bag or capable of making you believe they could. They can do some really pretty things athletically, like gymnastics exercise, gymnastic floor exercises, really physically impressive if you watch it. But they don't look like they could intimidate anybody. They just look like kids that, wash your car on the weekends. I don't know. I'm just not impressed with them.
I mean, there's always. I was going to say, there's always room for, in wrestling, a slimy, small heel, though. I mean, because Adam Cole was very good at that in NXT, but at the moment he's a babyface who's 1 week yellow and 1 week not yellow.
The whole character, I mean, if you look at AEW, if you look at that roster, there's only a handful of guys on that roster that look like wrestlers. The rest of them look like they're guys that are working in a department store stacking shoe boxes. I mean, they're just some of the most physically unimpressive people I've ever seen in a wrestling company. Adam Cole being one of them. I mean, I'm almost 70 years old, and I know I could take him. I mean, and you don't want that with a wrestling character. Whether they're badasses or not, you want the impression at least that they are, or they could be. And so much of that talent, whether it's Darby Allin or Orange Cassidy or Adam Cole, I mean, just like, they do not look like a wrestler. They just don't.
Speaking of someone who looks like a wrestler, Ed Ferrara.
I think Ed's a good person. I think he's probably to a degree fairly talented, but didn't really have much to contribute. He wasn't a bad writer. He could take an idea and turn it actually into a story. So in that regard, he was valuable, but he didn't understand the wrestling audience. He was a good writer, but for example, you could be a great comic book writer. Like, that could be your specialty. That doesn't mean you can write comedy. Or you could be a great comedy writer, but that doesn't mean you could write an action film. These are disciplines, and people need to be good at their respective disciplines in order to be successful. I think Ed was a decent writer who understood the fundamentals of writing stories, but he didn't understand the wrestling audience. So he wasn't able to write material that really connected with the audience he should have been connected with.
Bully Ray.
One of my favorite people. He's such a bully. First of all, Bully is very smart in general. He's a very intelligent man. He's well read. He pays attention to things that are going on around him outside of the wrestling world. He also has a really good instinct for human psychology and is able to connect his take on psychology to professional wrestling and is really, really good at it. He really understands psychology.
Lance Storm.
A legend in his own mind. I mean, probably a nice guy. I've been around him a little bit. But he never really accomplished anything. He's a very opinionated person that doesn't have any accomplishments other than having been in the business for a period of time. Nothing against him. Like I said, I'm sure he's a nice guy, and he probably has a perspective on how to train wrestlers, because that's really what he's spent the majority of his career doing. But his time in front of the camera, whether it was WCW or WWE, was, I don't know, not notable.
Gene Okerlund.
One of a kind. Gene Okerlund, I mean, he had the pipes on that guy, the voice, the projection, but his ability to interview somebody with no personality, no experience, really not understanding their own character, Gene Okerlund would have the ability to make that interview great. He was like the Ric Flair of announcers, meaning Ric Flair, and I can say this from personal experience, Ric Flair could wrestle a broomstick, that would be me, and make the broomstick look reasonably good. There were a few, Arn Anderson, same way. There were some, Ricky Steamboat, same way. There are some wrestlers that their most valuable asset is working with people that have less talent, less experience, and making them look a whole lot better than they really are. That's what people like to work with, guys like Ric Flair. Gene Okerlund was that guy for announcers. Gene Okerlund could interview a broomstick, and all of a sudden you're listening to the broomstick, or you think you are, and you're going, this is the best broom I've ever seen. Wow. That was Gene Okerlund, man. He was a Ric Flair of announcers.
What I like about Okerlund is he could just come out with the biggest pile of bullshit, but say it so confidently that like once I'm sure he said, I covered the 1972 and 1976 Olympics. It's like, no, you didn't. Maybe for your local radio station you did, but you didn't cover anything. And just anything that the wrestlers would say, he would somehow validate it. He had that sort of, the authority to validate some of the most outlandish claims.
Yeah, and it was as if it really happened. And truly what happened is, what years of the Olympics did he say he covered? 72?
Oh, 72, 76. I plucked them out thin air around.
What he really probably did was had a beer at a bar with somebody that was actually in the Olympics in 1972. But he converted that moment in time into him covering it for a major news outlet.
Next name is Ray Traylor.
Never got to really know Ray real well. Just, did a few things with him outside of wrestling. An incredible big man, was very, very athletic for a guy as big as he was. Wonderful guy. He took my son deer hunting. My son got his very first deer with Ray Traylor. We're out, Ray Traylor, myself, my son Garrett, and Rick Steiner. We're all out deer hunting in Georgia. And Ray was actually with my son when he got his first deer. So that was pretty cool.
Another person who's recently died, Sid Vicious.
I liked Sid. Sid was a good man. I never had any issues at all with Sid. I had heard how difficult he could be to work with sometimes. I never experienced any of that. He was honest. He looked you in the eye when he talked to you. He was transparent about things, and he was a team player. For me, I have nothing but respect and fond memories for Sid.
Leaving the Victory Road thing out, Jeff Hardy.
What an interesting performer. Very creative guy. Eccentric. Yes, eccentric, but in a very interesting way, compelling way.
Is there anyone in wrestling history who has the ability to have like no storyline or anything going for him, can be as cold as anything, and just get hot on his own? He just has that weird charisma that people gravitate towards.
You hit it right on the head. It's that charisma, that connection to the audience. They don't need a story to fall in love with Jeff Hardy, and that's very unusual. He's like, there's certain actors, like for me, it's Denzel Washington. If there's a movie coming out and Denzel Washington's in the movie, I don't care who else is in the movie. I don't care who's directing it. I don't care who's writing it. None of that matters. I'm going to go see that movie because Denzel's in it. Jeff Hardy has that same kind of connection to the wrestling audience. It doesn't matter what's going on. You're just going because you want to see whatever Jeff Hardy's going to do next. Very, very compelling character.
Gail Kim.
Gail, very little. I had very little to do with Gail Kim. I never really got to know her personally. She was a great performer at a time when it was very difficult for a woman to be a great performer. They were kind of cast as, eye candy, salacious, kind of eye candy, whatever. But she was very athletic, very determined from what I remember. But I never really got to know her too well.
I'll give you a few more, then we'll move on. You may have a personal story, a rib story, Kurt Hennig.
I was a big fan of Kurt. Kurt's from Minneapolis. He went to high school the same place as my wife did, Robbinsdale High School. We had a lot of mutual friends before I ever got into the wrestling business. Of course, his father, Larry the Axe Hennig, was one of my favorites as a young kid growing up in Minneapolis. Really, really impressive performer and intimidating. But I never got ribbed by Kurt. Fortunately, I'm blessed that way. I was never a victim. But always liked being around Kurt because he was always having fun. I never saw Kurt where he wasn't having a great time. And you like being around people like that.
Randy Orton.
One of the best.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt you there. I hear that so often from people within the business. Maybe not fans as much as people within the business who recognize how great he is.
So phenomenal. He is, and it's unfortunate that, because the average wrestling fan, they're not looking for the nuances. They don't notice them. But if you really are, if you love the art of professional wrestling, you look at Randy Orton and you realize that you could watch Randy Orton in a 15-minute wrestling match. And Randy Orton can do more with a look than most guys can physically throughout the. Randy Orton could accomplish more with a glance than the Young Bucks can in a main event match on a pay-per-view. He just has the ability to connect with the audience, to tell a story, to sell. You hear the term sell in professional wrestling a lot. It's as an actor, if you talk to anybody that's a professional actor or actress, they'll tell you acting is nothing but reacting. You as an actor, your art is your ability to react in a way that creates drama and connective tissue to the story or whoever you're working with. Randy has that ability, and he does it with every fiber of his body. His selling is second to none. And that's the art that I appreciate the most. I think that's the art and the talent that Randy has that most people who are in the business appreciate because they notice it more. They notice people that have been in the business for a long time and appreciate it, particularly if you're a performer, you appreciate the little things, the nuance that makes something good, as opposed to the very visual, obvious things. It's a difference between bright fluorescent colors spray painted on the side of a building. Yeah, it's bright. Yeah, it's noticeable. Catches your attention, but it's not a Monet, right? Randy's a Monet.
Are there any unique nuances that Randy Orton does that nobody else does in the business? Anything that you can ascribe to Randy specifically that you're impressed with?
The minute he walks into the ring, when he gets up on that turnbuckle and does his pose and looks up there, it's a living statue. You want to kind of just have reverence for it. He's just such a powerful character. I think Randy is probably going to go down as one of the best performers of this generation. Maybe two. Shawn Michaels is up there, but for different reasons. I think Randy's a much better performer than even Shawn Michaels, and I hold Shawn Michaels in very high esteem as a performer.
I saw him live last month. I went to the WWE show in Manchester, and all me and my friend could say, who I went with, God damn, he's massive. He's huge, that guy. He's even bigger in real life. I know it sounds a weird thing to say, but especially with a lot of 6 foot plus guys on the card, he stood out as really, really cut, really huge. So he definitely had presence. Huge presence.
No doubt.
Next one, Conan.
I love Conan. Ahead of his time, so many ways. Um, deserves a lot more credit and respect for his contributions to professional wrestling than he gets. Has a great understanding of how the business works, he has a great understanding of the wrestling industry, the psychology that comes with it, what works, what doesn't work. It's unfortunate that Conan, Conan's got a strong personality. We didn't always get along. When he worked for me, we were, there were some difficult times there, but we're pretty good friends to this day. And even though we have different opinions on certain things, particularly politically, socially, but we can sit down and have a thoroughly satisfying and enjoyable conversation, and not necessarily a debate, but we challenge each other's opinions, but in a way that's constructive and positive. I like people like that.
Do you think that Conan doesn't get his just due? It's almost like a North American arrogance as far as, well, it may have worked in Mexico, but, what did you do up here kind of thing? Because I don't think that many people realize what an enormous star he was in Mexico for years and years and years, and still is.
I don't know if it's an arrogance. Probably like a lot of things, it has more to do with ignorance than arrogance. When you don't know anything, it's really easy to have an opinion that's based on bullshit, right?
Hmm.
Dave Meltzer, again, keep going back to him. But Conan obviously became a huge thing. He was like the Hulk Hogan he was like the Hulk Hogan / Brad Pitt of Mexico. He was amazingly popular. And that's cool and all, but that's not whatever impressed me. What impressed me so much about Conan, and Conan really deserves a lot of credit for the success of the NWO. He had nothing to do with it in the beginning, obviously, but Conan had a cool factor because Conan had his finger on the pulse of culture and was able to kind of bring that street credibility that was so important at the time in the mid 90s. He brought that character to the NWO, and it rubbed off on Scott Hall. It rubbed off on Kevin Nash. So that between Nash and Hall and Conan, Hulk Hogan was Hulk Hogan. He was like the evil bad guy, but Hulk didn't necessarily have a cool factor. He was a badass, but he didn't have that cool factor. Nash, Hall, and Conan had it in spades. And it was in large part because of Conan's influence on Scott and on Kevin. When you see them come to the ring, they had their headbands on and, they looked like a couple of gangbangers. That was all Conan. But that added to the mystique of the NWO in a very powerful way. And that was Conan. That was Conan's influence. So Conan, and here's another thing that Conan deserves a lot more credit for. The cruiserweight division, which actually really was responsible for much more of Nitro's success than even I gave it credit for when we were doing it. It wasn't until afterwards, years later, that I really recognized that the cruiserweight division and the luchadors and a lot of the Japanese that we were bringing in, and the fact that we featured the cruiserweight division each and every week and made it an important part of the show was one of the biggest differentiators between WCW and WWE at that time. And it laid the groundwork for a lot of the performers that we see today. Were it not for the cruiserweight division and Conan's influence on the cruiserweight division and the luchadors that he brought in, Rey Mysterio would not have gone on to the success that he did in WWE. A lot of the smaller wrestlers that now have, that are making 6 and 7 figure incomes would not be having those opportunities were it not for the influence of Conan and the luchadors that Conan brought in. Conan deserves a lot of credit for that.
I'll give you 2 more, then we'll move on. Batista?
No real impression of Batista. I worked in WWE while he was there, but I don't think I've said more than 3 or 4 words to Batista.
Okay,
other than hello and goodbye.
We'll move on then. Last one. He's still doing it today, Tony Schiavone.
He's a workhorse. He's loyal to a fault, but he's a workhorse. You cannot outwork Tony Schiavone. You can't even try to break him by dumping too much work on him because he will just put his head down and do the fucking work. And you'll never know how he feels about it because he'll always project a team player. I don't know how he puts up with what he puts up with in AEW, quite frankly. He's a better man than I am. He's a stronger man than I am emotionally and psychologically because I couldn't do what Tony Schiavone's doing. I feel bad for him out there representing a product that I know he knows is the absolute drizzling shits.
Right then, in Dark Side of the Ring, you said you saw a lot of fraud and theft as a fly on the wall before you were WCW Vice President. Then, going forward, the WCW Sale. When did you realise, essentially, that, obviously with Fusion Media, you got some money together, you got some investors. When did you realise that the fix was in? And when did you fully realise the full extent of the fix being in?
Not until the series Who Killed WCW that Rock produced, Brian Gewirtz. When I heard from Stu Snyder, we all heard from Stu Snyder. I saw Brad Siegel's reaction to some of the questions that he was confronted with. And I know bullshit when I see it. And I knew when I saw Brad Siegel's response on camera to some of the questions that were asked relating to his buddy Stu Snyder and Brad's role in facilitating the sale to WWE, Brad was visibly uncomfortable. He knew that he had some involvement in that, and it was less than honest and straightforward. And it was so apparent in Brad's reaction. That's when I knew for sure. Of course, I heard rumors and, but I never pay attention to things like that. But when I saw Brad Siegel's reaction to some of the questions asked in that series, I knew that's what I knew the fix was. And that was just within the last 6 months or a year.
Mm-hmm. When did you start getting inklings? I mean, round the time, or could you just not understand why they would not go with you and would rather give the company away for 1/100th of what you were offering or whatever it was?
Well, I was so, I don't want to say angry. That's not the right word. I was so frustrated with Turner because it wasn't just that. I mean, my experience with Turner Broadcasting starting in about late August of 1998, prior to August of 1998, I would have given a body part to that company. If Ted Turner would have called me on Monday and said, look, when you come to work Tuesday, you need to have your left hand cut off, I would have done that. I mean, I was so loyal to that company and to Ted. And it wasn't just me. Ted Turner was a great leader. He was a visionary, and he inspired others to be a visionary. He inspired others to take risks that working in a corporate environment, you would never be, encouraged to take. Ted Turner believed that you never achieve anything great unless you put yourself at risk in the process. And that's the way he lived his life. I haven't seen the documentary yet, doesn't matter. But my experience with Ted, even directly and even indirectly, just being in proximity, this guy was an entrepreneur's entrepreneur, much like Elon Musk. Great comparison, obviously, different disciplines, but he reminded me a lot of Elon Musk in that regard. Once the merger's starting to happen Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but Ted Turner was essentially being stuck in a closet and really had no more influence over the company that he created. And in his place came a lot of, corporate types that are like cookie cutter corporate types that lack vision. They lack leadership skills. And that's what happened to Turner Broadcasting. I mean, AOL Time Warner AOL doesn't even exist anymore because of these cookie cutter executives who started getting involved in businesses they didn't understand, but were so arrogant and thought they could figure out. They actually ruined the businesses they touched. Gerald Levin and Steve Case should be both condemned to corporate hell for the disasters that they created with that company. It's unfortunate.
One more thing that ties in, and I will let you go, I promise you. Was there ever any idea of floating WCW on the stock market as its own entity? Was it ever brought up?
No, never.
That was just for me. I just wanted to know. Right, okay then, Eric. I know you've got other stuff to do today. I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time. I would have let you go earlier.
It's been an absolute pleasure. If I would have known it was going to, take this long, I would have blocked more time. But look, you know how to reach me. Anytime you want to do another one of these, right after the first of the year, let's schedule another one. We'll get to the questions you didn't get to ask.
Hey, I will not leave it 2 years like I did last time. Once again, Eric Bischoff is going to be at MLW One Shot December 5th, Queens, New York. Go there, support him, buy some tickets. Every single penny that Eric is making is going to charity for that show. Once again, what is it?
Tunnel to Towers.
There we go, Tunnel to Towers. And I'll tell you what, I'll put a link on I'll pin the comments, pin the comment on the description as well, and hopefully make a bit more money for them as well. So until then, until part 3, we will see you again. I don't know who I'm interviewing next because I never know that, but we'll see you again for that. Thank you, Eric, and I'll catch you again next year, I guess.
Look forward to it.